December 27, 1944. The mountains of Yugoslavia stretched endlessly below, snow-covered peaks hiding 1,000 dangers. Colonel George Kraigher gripped the controls of his Douglas C-47 Skytrain, leading a formation into the heart of Nazi-occupied territory. Behind him sat 20 rescued American airmen, men who should have been prisoners of war or worse. Ahead lay a frozen airstrip built by hand in the wilderness, barely long enough for a safe landing. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Transport planes weren't meant to operate behind enemy lines. But Operation Halyard was proving that sometimes impossible was just another word for necessary. Kraigher knew better than most what this mission meant. Born in Serbia, he had fought the Germans once before, as a young pilot for the Royal Serbian Air Force in World War I. Now, 25 years later, he was back, leading the largest behind-enemy lines rescue operation in history. The story began 6 months earlier, when American bombers started falling from European skies in alarming numbers. The 15th Air Force had been hammering Nazi oil facilities at Ploesti, Romania, missions so dangerous that air crews called them trips to hell. Damaged bombers limping home often didn't make it. They crashed in the mountains of Yugoslavia, leaving their crews scattered across German-occupied territory. Most assumed these men were lost forever. Yugoslavia was a maze of competing factions, occupied by German forces and torn apart by civil war. Serbian Chetniks fought communist partisans, while both battled the Nazi occupiers. It was the last place anyone expected to mount a rescue operation. But reports began filtering back to Allied intelligence. American airmen were alive. They weren't in German prison camps. They were being hidden by Serbian villagers, protected by Chetnik fighters, and cared for by peasants who shared their meager food with complete strangers. General Draza Mihailovic, leader of the Chetnik resistance, had made protecting Allied airmen his personal mission. By August 1944, over 400 American airmen were scattered across Mihailovic's territory. They lived in barns and farmhouses, surviving on bread and goat's milk, constantly moving to stay ahead of German patrols. Some had been on the run for months, sustained only by the kindness of Serbian families who risked execution for helping them. The Office of Strategic Services knew these men needed help. But Yugoslavia was a political minefield. Britain supported Tito's communist partisans and opposed any contact with Mihailovic's Chetniks. The Soviet Union wanted nothing to do with royalist resistance fighters. Even discussing a rescue mission was controversial, but American airmen were dying in the mountains, and Colonel George Kraigher wasn't about to let politics kill his countrymen. Kraigher commanded the Aircrew Rescue Unit, and when reports reached him that hundreds of American aviators were trapped in Chetnik territory, he began planning the impossible. Kraigher was uniquely qualified for the challenge. Before the war, he had pioneered Pan-American Airways route from Miami to the Middle East, flying uncharted airways across Africa and the Atlantic. He understood navigation over hostile terrain, emergency landings in primitive conditions, and the split-second decisions that kept aircraft intact in impossible circumstances. More importantly, Kraigher understood the Serbian people. Born in the Balkans, he spoke the language and knew the culture. When reports reached his desk about American airmen being protected by Serbian villagers, he grasped what others missed. This was coordinated resistance led by people who valued Allied lives more than their own safety. The numbers were staggering. Over 400 American airmen were scattered across Mihailovic's territory. Captain Francis Musil from Illinois had walked 200 miles through German territory. Lieutenant Thomas Oliver from Oregon parachuted from a burning B-24 and found an elderly Serbian woman waiting with bread and milk. Throughout occupied Serbia, villagers risked execution for complete strangers. They shared food they couldn't spare, gave shelter they couldn't afford to lose, and fought German patrols to protect men they had never met. General Mihailovic had made protecting Allied aviators a sacred duty. The political situation made rescue operations nearly impossible. Britain's Churchill supported Tito's communist partisans, cutting off aid to Mihailovic's Chetniks. The Soviet Union opposed contact with royalist forces. American policy officially favored the partisans, making Operation Halyard diplomatically dangerous. On August 2, 1944, Kraigher's plan swung into action. Three OSS agents parachuted into Yugoslavia: Lieutenant George Mussolini, Master Sergeant Michael Rajacic, and radio operator Arthur Jabilian. Their mission was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Build an airstrip in enemy territory capable of handling C-47 transport aircraft. The insertion itself was fraught with danger. British pilots, hostile to the mission, had repeatedly provided wrong coordinates that would have dropped the team into German territory or partisan-controlled areas. Lieutenant Mussolini finally demanded an American aircraft with an American crew. Even then, the jump was a near disaster. Mussolini landed on a chicken coop, sending poultry flying in all directions. Rajacic got tangled in a tree and had to be cut down. Only Jabilian managed a soft landing in a cornfield. The landing site chosen was near Pranjani, a small village in the mountains of central Serbia. The location offered some natural cover, but it was still deep in German-controlled territory. Serbian villagers and Chetnik soldiers worked through the night, clearing trees, hauling rocks, and smoothing the ground, using nothing but hand tools and oxen. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Every tree had to be cut by hand and dragged away. Rocks were moved one by one, carried in baskets by women and children. The ground was packed down by hundreds of feet, tramping back and forth, working in shifts to avoid exhaustion. All of this happened under cover of darkness, with German patrols passing within miles of the construction site. Captain Zvonimir Vukovic supervised the construction with military precision. Over 100 volunteers worked each night, bringing their own tools and draft animals. They built drainage ditches to handle mountain runoff, cleared approach paths through the surrounding forest, and even constructed primitive runway lights using gasoline-soaked rags in tin cans. The security challenges were immense. German garrison forces controlled the main roads. Collaborationist units patrolled the villages. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights passed overhead daily. One wrong move, one careless light, one suspicious activity would bring down the full weight of German retaliation. By August 9th, they had carved a 700-yard runway from the mountainside. It was barely adequate for a C-47, short, rough, and surrounded by obstacles. One miscalculation would mean death for everyone aboard. The approach path threaded between mountain peaks, with no room for error and no chance for a second attempt. That night, Kraigher led 4 C-47s into Yugoslav airspace. Flying without lights, navigating by dead reckoning and radio signals, the formation slipped past German air defenses and located the improvised airstrip. Signal fires guided them in, hay bales soaked in gasoline, marking the edges of the runway like a primitive beacon system. The weather was deteriorating. Cloud cover obscured the mountains, and intermittent rain threatened to turn the dirt runway into impassable mud. Radio contact with the ground was sporadic, broken by atmospheric interference and the need to maintain radio silence until the last possible moment. The first aircraft overshot the runway and had to circle for another approach. Landing on an unlit strip in enemy territory surrounded by mountains was like threading a needle in a coal mine. The pilot, Captain Nathan Twining III, son of the 15th Air Force commander, fought crosswinds and downdrafts as he brought his C-47 around for a second attempt. This time, the landing was perfect. The transport touched down at the very beginning of the runway, brakes screaming as it decelerated through the mud. Serbian villagers rushed from the tree line, embracing American airmen they had protected for months. Wounded men were carried aboard on stretchers improvised from barn doors. Others walked under their own power, some wearing peasant clothes given to them by their rescuers. The loading process was chaos controlled by rigid discipline. Each aircraft could carry only a limited number of passengers, and the weight had to be distributed carefully to maintain balance. Medical cases received priority, followed by airmen who had been on the ground longest. Some men had to be left behind, a heartbreaking decision that would haunt everyone involved. Within minutes, the aircraft were loaded and ready for takeoff. The engines roared as each C-47 accelerated down the makeshift runway, pulling into the night sky just above the treetops. By dawn, 241 Allied airmen were safely back in Italy, the largest single rescue operation of the war. But Operation Halyard was far from over. More American bombers continued to fall over Yugoslavia. More air crews needed rescue, and Colonel Kraigher continued to lead mission after mission into enemy territory, each one as dangerous as the last. The August missions established a pattern that would continue for months. Intelligence identified stranded airmen. OSS agents organized collection points. Serbian villagers provided labor and security, and Kraigher's crews flew into Nazi-occupied Europe to bring their countrymen home. Each mission brought new challenges. German forces increased patrols around suspected landing sites. Weather became a factor as autumn progressed. Mountain fog, rain turning runways to mud, snow in higher elevations. The second major operation on August 15th evacuated 110 Allied personnel from Pranjani. The September missions required fighter escort as German air activity increased. The November operations evacuated groups from 3 separate locations across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Winter brought the operation to its climax. On November 1st, Kraigher led 2 C-47s to Boljanik, deep in the Ozren Mountains. The 1,300-foot runway was frozen solid, requiring precision flying between mountain peaks in deteriorating weather. The mission was a complete success, evacuating 15 American airmen who had been on the ground since summer. But intelligence reports indicated this would likely be the final opportunity for large-scale rescue operations. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, and the political situation made continued American operations impossible. December 27, 1944, marked the end of Operation Halyard. Kraigher's final mission was both triumph and tragedy. Perfect execution of an impossible plan, just as the window of opportunity closed forever. The weather was appalling. Snow squalls swept the mountains, cloud cover extended to the treetops. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters provided escort as Kraigher threaded between mountain peaks in a snowstorm, navigating by dead reckoning and intermittent radio beacons. His approach to Boljanik was masterful precision flying. The touchdown was perfect on the ice-covered runway. 20 Allied personnel climbed aboard, including the final OSS Halyard team members who had spent 6 months behind enemy lines. As his C-47 lifted off from Boljanik for the last time, Kraigher closed a remarkable chapter in aviation history. Below him, Serbian villagers stood in the snow, waving goodbye to the American aircraft. Behind him, General Mihailovich faced an uncertain future as communist forces advanced toward their mountain strongholds. Operation Halyard rescued 512 Allied airmen from Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia. Not a single rescued airman was lost during the 6-month operation. Not one C-47 was shot down. It was a feat of airmanship, courage, and international cooperation that has never been equaled. The Serbian price was enormous. Villagers who helped Allied airmen faced execution if caught by German forces. Entire families were shot for hiding American pilots. Chetnik fighters died protecting men they had never met, simply because they wore Allied uniforms. General Mihailovich himself would be executed by Tito's forces after the war, his role in saving Allied lives forgotten in the political chaos that followed. For Colonel George Kraigher, Operation Halyard represented the culmination of a remarkable aviation career. He had flown combat missions in 2 world wars, pioneered commercial air routes across 3 continents, and led the largest rescue operation in military history. His Serbian heritage gave him unique insight into the Yugoslav situation, and his aviation expertise made the impossible missions possible. After the war, Kraigher returned to civilian aviation, continuing the pioneering work that had made him famous. But he never forgot the Serbian villagers who risked everything to save American lives, or the C-47 crews who flew into hell and brought their countrymen home. The rescued airmen never forgot either. For the rest of their lives, they honored the memory of General Mihailovich and the Serbian people who saved them. They lobbied the American government to recognize Mihailovich's contribution to the Allied war effort. In 1948, President Harry Truman posthumously awarded Mihailovich the Legion of Merit, one of America's highest honors for foreign allies. Operation Halyard remained classified for decades, its story buried in government archives. The political sensitivities of the Cold War made it inconvenient to celebrate an operation that highlighted communist brutality and Serbian heroism. Only in the 1990s did the full story emerge, thanks to the efforts of surviving participants and military historians. Today, a monument stands in the village of Pranjani, marking the site where Colonel Kraigher and his pilots landed their C-47s in the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. It honors not just the American airmen who were rescued, but the Serbian villagers who saved them and the pilots who made the impossible possible. George Kraigher proved that sometimes the most important missions happen far from the headlines. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, flying primitive aircraft into improvised airstrips, he and his fellow pilots wrote one of the most remarkable chapters in aviation history. The chapter where courage landed behind enemy lines and everyone came home.